Elias Thorne had spent 40 years listening to the heartbeat of the Kalahari, but he had never heard it thrum as loudly as it did tonight. When a heavy, resonant thud shook his cabin door during a violent storm, he didn't find a traveler or a neighbor. He found a queen in distress. Standing on his threshold was a pregnant lioness, her amber eyes carrying a plea that no human could ignore. Stay with us as we witness the night a predator became a guest, and a man became the midwife to a royal lineage. Chapter 1: The Gathering of the Storm. The evening sky over the jagged edge of the Kalahari was not a simple blue, but a bruised and angry violet, streaked with veins of electric gold that promised a night of uncommon violence. It was the kind of sky that made the birds fall silent and the insects burrow deep into the cooling sand, sensing a shift in the very atmosphere of the world. At the fringe of the civilized world sat a small, sun-bleached cabin belonging to Elias Thorne, a man who had spent 40 years listening to the heartbeat of the wild. Elias was a man of few words and many memories, his face a map of the harsh sun and the dry winds he had called neighbors for decades. He lived in a solitude that most would find maddening, but for him, the silence was a conversation he was never tired of hearing. Yet, tonight, the silence was different. It was thick, expectant, and heavy with a tension that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up like dry grass in a breeze. The wind began to shift, carrying a strange, heavy scent into the cabin through the cracks in the timber walls, something metallic, musky, and ancient that made the local hounds retreat beneath the porch. They didn't bark, they simply tucked their tails and let out low, vibrating whimpers that spoke of a fear older than their domestic lives. Elias sat by his hearth, watching the embers glow like the eyes of a resting dragon, feeling the weight of the coming storm. He rose to check the latches, his boots thudding softly on the worn floorboards that had seen countless seasons of dust and rain. There was a sense that the boundary between the safety of his porch and the infinite hunger of the plains was beginning to dissolve, the air growing electric with a presence he couldn't yet name. He felt like a character in a story whose page was about to be turned by a very large, unseen hand. Outside, the first crack of thunder rolled across the dunes, a deep and resonant sound that felt like the earth itself was clearing its throat. Elias stood by the window, his hand resting on the iron bolt of the door, peering into the gloom where the acacia trees looked like twisted skeletons against the violet clouds. He knew the wild, but tonight, he felt like a guest in a house that was no longer his own. Chapter 2: The Knock at the World's End. It wasn't a knock in any traditional sense, not the polite rapping of a neighbor or the frantic pounding of a lost traveler. Instead, it was a heavy, resonant thud against the timber door, a sound of immense weight and weary force that caused the tea in Elias's tin mug to ripple in perfect, rhythmic circles. The cabin seemed to groan under the pressure, the wood vibrating with a low frequency that Elias felt in the marrow of his own bones. He stood frozen for a heartbeat, his mind racing through the possibilities of what could be standing on his threshold in the middle of a Kalahari tempest. He unlatched the heavy iron bolt with a hand that was surprisingly steady, though his heart was drumming a frantic rhythm against his ribs. As the door swung inward, the lantern light spilled out onto the porch, carving a golden path into the darkness. He didn't find a man, but a vision of primal desperation that stopped the very breath in his lungs. Standing, or rather, swaying, under the amber glow was a lioness of immense stature, her golden coat matted with the grey dust of 100 miles and the dark stains of the rain. She was a queen of the Veldt, a creature of absolute power, yet she stood before him with her head bowed, her dignity frayed by a pain that knew no crown. Her amber eyes, usually filled with the cold, calculating fire of the hunt, were now glazed and liquid, carrying a plea so profound it bypassed the intellect and spoke directly to the soul. She didn't growl, and she didn't show her teeth in a display of hollow bravado, she simply looked at him, her chest heaving in shallow, ragged gasps. It was the look of a monarch who had come to the end of her strength and had nowhere else to turn. Elias stepped back, not in fear, but to allow her room to enter the small circle of light he called home. The lioness hesitated, her nostrils flaring as she caught the scent of wood smoke and human life, before she limped forward onto the porch. Each step was a monumental effort, her massive paws thudding heavily on the boards as if she were carrying the weight of the entire world on her sagging, exhausted shoulders. Chapter 3: The Burden of the Crown. Elias stepped onto the boards beside her, his hands raised in a gesture of ancient and universal peace, and only then did he see the true, staggering nature of this visitation. The lioness was heavily, perilously pregnant, her flanks distended and trembling with the onset of a labor that the harsh, unforgiving wilderness had made impossible to face alone. The wild, for all its beauty, has no mercy for the vulnerable, even for those who sit at the top of its hierarchy. She had sought the only light for leagues, driven by a maternal instinct that had overridden the centuries of blood feud between man and cat. In the vast, dark theater of the plains, she had chosen this humble cabin as her sanctuary, a decision born of a wisdom that transcended the boundaries of species. She was a mother first and a predator second, her pride swallowed by the overwhelming necessity of survival for the lives she carried. She let out a low, vibrating groan, a sound that was half prayer and half command, before her legs finally gave way beneath her. She collapsed at the threshold of his home, her heavy, regal head resting mere inches from Elias's boots. The vibration of her fall shook the entire cabin, a reminder of the sheer physical power that was now at his mercy, and a testament to the trust she had placed in a stranger. Elias looked down at her, feeling a surge of responsibility that was as heavy as the storm outside. He could see the ripples of muscle under her skin, the frantic movement of the cubs within her, and the sheer exhaustion that had turned this golden hunter into a shivering heap of fur. He was no veterinarian, but he was a man of the earth, and he knew that the next few hours would decide the fate of a royal lineage. The rain began to fall in earnest then, a sudden deluge that turned the world into a curtain of silver water, isolating the cabin from the rest of existence. Elias knew he couldn't leave her on the porch, but he also knew the danger of bringing a lioness into a confined space. He chose the middle path, dragging heavy canvas tarps and blankets to create a warm, dry nest around her, turning his porch into a royal birthing chamber. Chapter 4: The Midnight Midwife. The hours that followed were a blur of shadows and flickering silver light, a frantic ballet of blankets, warm water, and the low, rhythmic chanting of a man trying to soothe a goddess. Elias worked with a focus that bordered on the magical, his hands moving with a gentleness he didn't know he possessed. He fetched bowls of water and placed them near her muzzle, speaking in a low, melodic tone that seemed to act as an anchor for her drifting consciousness. The cabin became a sanctuary where the laws of the wild were temporarily suspended, the predator lay vulnerable and exposed, and the man became the humble protector. Every heave of her golden ribs felt like a tectonic shift in the room, a monumental struggle to bring forth the next generation under the flickering light of a kerosene lamp. The storm roared outside, but inside, the world had narrowed down to the rhythm of her breath and the warmth of the fire. Elias watched as she struggled, her massive claws occasionally unsheathing to grip the blankets in moments of peak agony, but she never once directed her frustration toward him. It was as if she understood that he was the only thing standing between her and the abyss, a silent pact of cooperation forged in the heat of a crisis. He wiped the sweat and rain from her brow, his heart aching at the sheer intensity of the life force radiating from her. He found himself narrating the night to her, telling her stories of the plains and the seasons, his voice a steady hum that filled the gaps between the claps of thunder. He was the midnight midwife, a solitary human witness to a royal birth that would never be recorded in any book, but would be written in the stars above the Kalahari. The air was thick with the scent of life, warm, metallic, and triumphant, as the night reached its deepest point. Just when it seemed her strength would finally fail, a change occurred in the atmosphere of the porch. The lioness gave one final, earth-shaking groan, her body tensing into a bow of golden muscle before finally going slack. Elias held his breath, the silence of the room becoming so absolute that he could hear the ticking of his old wall clock, waiting for the first sign that the struggle had been worth the cost. Chapter 5: The Dawn of the Princes. As the first fingers of dawn began to stroke the horizon, painting the sands in shades of peach and rose, the silence of the cabin was broken by a sound as delicate as a bird's wing. It was a tiny, high-pitched mewl, a sound of life asserting itself against the vastness of the desert. Elias looked down and saw a spotted bundle of fur, no larger than a loaf of bread, squirming against the lioness's golden flank. Soon, there were three tiny, spotted princes of the plains, their eyes still closed to the world but their lungs filling with the crisp, post-storm air. They were a miracle of biology, a testament to the mother's endurance and the man's unexpected care. The lioness, her strength slowly returning like a tide, let out a soft, rasping purr that vibrated through the floorboards like a distant, benevolent thunderstorm. She began to lick them with a tongue as rough as sandpaper, her movements rhythmic and full of an ancient, maternal grace. Each stroke of her tongue brought more life into their small bodies, cleaning away the traces of their difficult journey. Elias sat a few feet away, his back against the cabin wall, watching the first light of a new day illuminate the most beautiful scene he had ever witnessed in 40 years of wilderness living. She looked up at Elias then, and in that long, unblinking gaze, there was a silent acknowledgement that moved him more than any words ever could. It was a recognition of a debt, a soul-to-soul thank you that transcended the divide between human and beast. He was no longer just a man in a cabin, he was the godfather of a line, the silent partner in a miracle that had unfolded under his roof. The sun rose higher, turning the Kalahari into a sea of liquid gold, and for a moment, the world felt perfect. The cubs tumbled over one another, seeking the warmth of their mother, their small claws kneading her fur as they began to nurse. Elias knew that his life would never be the same. He had been chosen by the wild, and he had answered the call with the only thing that mattered, his presence. Chapter 6: The Return to the Infinite. The parting happened not with a roar, but with a quiet, regal dignity that felt like the closing of a great hall door at the end of a long ceremony. A week had passed, a week in which the porch had been a nursery and Elias had been a silent guardian, providing food and safety while the family gathered their strength. The cubs were now strong enough to walk on unsteady, velvet paws, their curiosity leading them to the very edge of the boards. The lioness stood, her muscles now fluid and powerful once more, the exhaustion of the birth a distant memory replaced by the vigilance of a mother. She looked toward the open horizon, where the tall grass swayed in the morning breeze, beckoning her back to the life she was born to lead. She nudged her young toward the sand, her movements firm but patient as she guided them toward their true home. At the edge of the clearing, she paused, her massive body silhouetted against the rising sun. She turned her head back to look at the porch, where Elias stood with his hands in his pockets, a solitary figure in the vastness of the plains. There was no growl, no display of teeth, just a final, deep look that seemed to summarize the entire week of shared silence and survival. She vanished into the gold of the high grass, her cubs following like three small shadows in her wake, until the only thing left of their visit was a set of tracks in the damp sand. Elias watched until the last tip of a tail disappeared, the silence of the cabin returning, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was a silence filled with the echo of a purr and the memory of a trust that most men would never know. He went back inside and closed the door, sliding the iron bolt home with a quiet click. The cabin was empty, but he knew that the story of the Midnight Queen would be whispered by the wind long after he was gone. He sat by his hearth and picked up his tin mug, looking out at the endless horizon, knowing that somewhere out there, a royal line was continuing because for one night, a man and a lioness had decided to be friends. The Midnight Queen has returned to the plains, but her story lives on with us. If you believe that compassion can bridge any divide, hit that subscribe button and join our pride. We bring you the most extraordinary stories of the bond between man and the wild every single week. Don't let the next miracle pass you by.